The block I'll be working on today from the Dear Jane quilt book is L-11, also called Caitlin's Rose. When we take a closer look at this block, we're going to notice that there is a difference between the original block that Jane made and the block that Brenda Papadakis had drafted out. As I've said before, I'm trying very hard to make my blocks as close to Jane's as possible. And this one bothers me with how different it is. So the first thing I did to redraft this block is I drew the exact same block. I'm going to move this over a little so you can see. I drew the same exact block, but I added a center square. So I added this center square. When you look here, you can see now I've got this center square, which would be the foundation fabric. And then these triangles and this will be the background. And then foundation fabric on these little sections here, background on these triangles. But when I redrafted it, it made this center seem much smaller. And these border sections here seem much fatter than what they are in Jane's block. So it has a little more of the sense of what it should look like, but it really doesn't. So I did another drafting of the block. So here is my first drafting of just adding that center square, but I wanted to get it more in tune to the original look. I extended this out 1/8 of an inch all the way around, which then meant I redrew these triangles. And these were able to stay the same. They just got reduced a little bit more. And then I took that center square. Now that this had been extended out, I then extended that out so that the points matched. So that was extended out 1/8 of an inch. And in doing that redrafting, when I put my block here, in my mind it gives a better feel for the overall look of this block to what Jane had made as opposed to the one that Brenda had made. So I will be working from this redrafted block to create L-11. The main fabric that I've chosen for this block is this purple, and my background again is this muslin fabric. So let me walk through how we're going to make this block. The first thing I'll do is cut this center square out of the foundation fabric. And when I measure this square, it measures 2.5 inches square. So I will cut a piece of fabric from my foundation to be 3 inches to have that seam allowance. And then I will measure to cut the triangles. When I'm measuring the triangles, I come to about 1 3/4, it looks like. So to cut these triangles, I think what I will do is cut a 2.5 inch square and cut it in half. So that will give me either triangle here. So I'll cut out of the muslin fabric, 2.5 inch squares, and cut those on half on the diagonal, and that should give me my triangles. I now have the center section of this block finished. It's pretty simple, just sewing these triangles on. Now let's look at the next section for this block. Looking again at Jane's original block and the one that I redrafted, we see here, this is the center section that we've got finished. Now we've got these little sections here around the border. Looking at these border strips, all 4 are the same, but they're going to have a little triangle here of that muslin or background fabric, and then 2 strips of the focus fabric. So I think what I'll do is cut a strip of the focus fabric and then cut these little triangles and try to piece these strips on. So first we're going to cut that triangle. When I'm measuring that triangle looks to be, when I put my ruler here just on the triangle itself, we've got about 1 5/8, but I'm going to add that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance that I would need, and then it needs to go in another 1/4 of an inch. So it looks like the triangle, to give enough room, is going to need to be 1.5 inch triangle. So what I'm actually going to do is cut a square that is 1.5 inches and then cut it on the diagonal to get the two opposite triangles. So I'll start first with cutting 1.5 inch squares. I'll have 2 of those so that I can cut it in half to make 4 of those triangles. My 4 triangles are now cut, and when I look at the strips here, they are measuring at 1/2 inch finished. So I need to have that 1/4 of an inch on either side. So that would be 1 inch. But they're also on the outer edge here, and I like to have that little bit of extra room. So I'm actually going to cut the strips to be 1.25 inches, so that way I have that room around the edge for trimming my blocks. So I'm going to cut 1.25 inch of my focus fabric of the strips. I have my rectangles now cut, and I didn't say what size that they needed to be cut as far as the length, but when we look at the piece here, I'm going to kind of just eyeball it. The center of the triangle is about here, and it goes to about here, so it needs to be at least 2.25 inches long. And that's what these parts are, and then these ones are a little bit longer. I was just cutting these rectangles from a strip that I already had, and that was the width that they were. So now that I have these cut, we're going to look at how to do this part, and this is actually just going to be kind of eyeballing it. So what I'm going to do is just line up the rectangle to my triangle, and I'm going to draw a line, and that will be my sewing line. So I'll probably have it overlap just a little bit, and that right there, so I'll line it up and I'll draw a line on the back of the rectangle. That'll be my stitching line. You'll notice I've overlapped just a little bit, so that'll give me that seam allowance that I need there. So then I can just match up the rectangle with the triangle, and I'll stitch it and press it, and then I'll have one side. So I'll do that on each side of all 4 of these triangles and have those rectangles all stitched down so that I can have that strip. So I'll check back in after I get one side sewn on. Here is one side of the triangle and rectangle sewn together. These shorter rectangles that were about 2.25, they might not even have been, yeah, they were 2.25. These were definitely not long enough. I ended up being short. But these ones that measure 2.5, they're actually just slightly over, so it'd be 2 5/8. These work really well. These give me the right amount of length that I need. So when I line my triangle up, I can see my triangle right there. When I line that up, I've got enough of an overlap here where I'm going to need to trim. So I'm going to cut 4 more of the rectangles that will be the right length, 2 5/8. And then I will sew the rest of the rectangles to the triangles. I have one strip finished, and it measures out really well. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a walkthrough of how I am putting these together. So here I have my little triangle, and these are the two rectangles that have already been trimmed for the sizes that I need. So when I put these together, let me put my needle down. I'm putting the raw edges together, and I have just a little bit of an overlap with this triangle edge, because then what will happen is once it's stitched and it's flipped over, we'll get a little bit more of a straight seam there. So I'm just lining that up, and I'll pin that so it doesn't move around on me. Okay, I've got that pinned, and now I'm going to sew the seam. And I've been making these blocks for many years, and so I have a pretty good sense of just eyeing that 1/4 inch seam. But if you wanted to draw a line for that, you can do that. And of course, as with any of these blocks, I'm doing them all by hand, but I think all of these tips and ideas can be adapted for machine piecing. So I'm coming up to the end of the triangle here. I'm going to do a little bit of a back stitch and continue on. Okay, and I'll remove that pin, trim that seam, or trim that thread. And now I have my rectangle on that side. I'm going to press it down so that I can trim the other side. Now we'll do the same for this side. And I'm just wanting to show you, you see how it, boy, that lines up almost perfectly with a nice straight edge there. But we'll pin this, and now I'll sew this seam. Ow. Ow, I just poked my thumb. Okay, we'll trim that thread off. And this side is ready to be pressed down. And there we have it. Here is another strip. When I measure this strip, I need to have the strip itself needs to finish at 3.5 inches. So I'm going to need a minimum of 4 inches. And when I measure this, I have 4 inches. This one might be a little tight, but that'll come out just fine. And this other one is definitely 4 inches. So now I've got 2 of them done. I'm going to sew 2 more. As you can see, I've gotten 2 of the opposite sides sewn on and a third side sewn on. I just have 1 more strip to sew on. And I just wanted to make sure that you'll be aware they won't meet up all the way at the edge, but that is because we're going to have a triangle that we're going to trim right across the corners here to be able to put another triangle on. So this is how it's going to be looking, but we line up these points here on your triangles when you're sewing them up. So I just have this last one that I will be stitching on, and then we can trim up these corners to start putting the other triangles on. The block has all the border sections sewn and pressed down really well, and now I need to get the corners cut for the triangles. In order to do that, first we need to measure to figure out how to cut those. I have this smaller ruler that I am measuring. At this point here, I'm measuring 1/4 inch out, so that's my seam allowance because the triangle is going to come right up to that edge. And then I make sure that this line here is lining up with those triangles, those small ones that are on the border. So as I line up, it's lined up right on this 1 inch line. Whoops, actually, no, it's not. Let me turn that just a little bit. You may need to adjust a little bit. Just make sure that you're lined up on the right line. There we go. Now those triangles are lined up right on that 1 inch, and I've got 1/4 of an inch here. So now I'll trim off that end and then sew the triangle down. So I'm going to do that around all 4 corners. We'll trim off that end. That will give me that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to stitch on there. Now, to figure out how large of a triangle I need, I am going to measure my triangle that's here. And let's see, I am measuring it so that I have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on either side. And when I line that up, my line is coming straight through. The triangle itself finishes at 1 1/4, but I need to have that seam allowance out here, which ends up being 1 1/2. But I want to be able to have a little extra room. And so I am actually going to make squares that are 1 3/4. And these squares that are cut 1 3/4, then I'll be able to cut directly in half on the diagonal and have triangles for either side. So I'm going to cut 2 squares at 1 3/4 out of the background or muslin fabric. I have 2 of the triangles sewn on, and I just wanted to show you when I put my ruler on, they just barely fit. So I would suggest on the triangles when you're making them, in order to have a good amount for trimming, make them just a little bit bigger when you cut. So instead of 1 3/4 of an inch for your square, go ahead and cut it 2 inches and cut it in half. That will give you just a little bit more room. All right, let's get the last 2 sewn on and the block pressed and trimmed. And there we have it. This is the finished block of L-11, also called Caitlin's Rose. And this block, again, is following more of Jane's design than what Brenda Papadakis had redrafted in her book. If you enjoyed following along as I made this block, you can like this video, and you can also subscribe so that you'll know each time I upload a video, which is generally every Monday. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave those below, or you can send me an email at sewitseamscreations@outlook.com. This is Veronica with Sew It Seams, and I'll see you next time.